Hi there, folks. Phoenix Aurelius here. I am the founder, chief spagyrist, and also chief of research here at the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy, where we explore the philosophies, practices, and therapies of early spagyric medicine, and we aim to create present-day standards for the research, education, and practice of spagyric medicine in the 21st century. Today, I want to talk to you about the Astronomological Calendar 2023 and how to be able to utilize it, some of its basics, and just how to get the most out of it. Suffice it to say that other astrological forms and calendars did not really cut the grade in our clinical tests over the last couple of years. In fact, since 2014, we've been at it for almost 10 years now. And we have been able to eliminate a lot of lesser accurate calendars for the working of spagyric purposes. So this astronomological calendar has taken a tremendous amount of effort and undertaking. There are a few things that you need to know about this calendar. The first thing is that all of the astrological data in here is calculated according to the style of true sidereal astrology, which is a term and a style coined by Athen Chimenti of masteringthezodiac.com. In all of our clinical studies and trials, this is the only one that has actually stood up and actually gives us great accuracy and repeatability, both in the laboratory as well as in the addressing of ens astrale issues in our clinical research, as well as being able to be quite evident in the soil and in agricultural applications as well. So that's the first thing. This style is called true sidereal astrology, and it is created by Athen Chimenti. We utilize a very specific set of parameters where it is almost identical to the night sky. When I say almost identical, there's only one change. The change is that when we actually look up at the sky, we see the end of one constellation, the beginning of another. They're not always right next to each other, where one star ends of one constellation, beginning the next star of the next constellation also begins. There's usually some space between them. That space between them is typically referred to as a void of course area. It means that things are not in one constellation or the other. For the purpose of astrology, with everything except for the moon, we don't necessarily know what it means. And especially here at the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy, one of our ideas is to try and figure out what it means if, say, Mars is actually in a void space between, say, Aries and Taurus, instead of just considering it a blend of both energies, as is commonly done at the present moment. So there is probably room for improvement in our understanding of astronomy and astrology, but for the present time, for all astrologers, everything except for the moon should be in one constellation or the other. And so the only difference between the astrological data and what you're actually going to see in the sky is that there is an imaginary midpoint that exists between the end of one constellation and the beginning of another, and that's where the cusp between two signs actually exists. Aside from that, you will find that if you go to inthesky.org or if you go to other astronomical software, you will see in the actual sky the positions of planets are almost identical to the astronomical positions that we have here. So that is one of the most important things to understand. It's not going to be 100% perfect, but it is about 98.9 even percent perfect. Again, the only discrepancies that you're going to see are we might say that something is in Taurus, where when you're looking at it in the actual sky, it's not going to be in Taurus for maybe a few more hours. And that's just because we draw the midpoint between two things. Now, again, the lunar data, or the position of the moon, or Luna, is the only one that's actually going to have void of course times in this. And again, that term void of course just simply means that it's not in one sign or the other. And we'll go back over that here in a bit. The second thing that you should really keep in mind is that all of the times in this calendar are set to US Eastern Time. That is Eastern Relative Time, meaning that when it's Eastern Standard Time, the time shows up in Eastern Standard Time. When it is Eastern Daylight Time, that switches to Eastern Daylight Time. You do not need to create daylight savings times adjustments with this calendar. They are already factored in and calculated for you, which actually was due to great effort on my part. of being able to know all of this, because UTC does not really care for daylight savings time. So I have to go in and manually change all of the data. At least the astronomical data, I think I have to change. The astrological data, I do not. So that is that. It's all going to be set to US Eastern Time. You are 1 hour behind if you are in US Central Time. You are 2 hours behind if you're in US Mountain Time. You are 3 hours behind if you're in US Pacific Time. If you are far enough in Alaska that you have a different time zone, or especially if you're in Hawaii or in Europe, you're going to have to find how much difference there is in number of hours between your time and Eastern time at any given time. And this also applies for Arizona. For instance, Arizona does not actually acknowledge daylight savings time. So you're going to have to know what those calculations are and be able to perform that calculation. Also, all of the locations are set to New York City, New York State, United States of America. That is where we're calculating everything from. Part of that is just because it is probably the biggest city on the eastern United States. And also there's going to be a greater concentration of people who are utilizing the calendar who are in that area, where all of the data is going to be very similar for them. So again, US Eastern Time, all of the positions are calculated from New York City. Now that may actually be a little bit different. The calculations might be a little bit different geographically, especially if you're farther north or farther south significantly of New York City. Things might not happen exactly at the same moment as we have here. That's why the times are included, but they are offered more as a guide rather than an absolutely strict thing that you have to follow to a T. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. So the other thing about this is that the calendar is formatted as a Gregorian calendar, meaning that we have the months of January through December, 12 months, and each of those days correspond with to no less than 28 days, such as in February, although some months can have as much as 31 days. And so we utilize January through December in the same systems, the Gregorian calendar. That's important because a lot of astronomical and maritime calendars still use a Julian calendar. And there are other reckonings of time. Many of you have probably heard that I'm working on a parapegma, and that is actually a lunisolar calendar and a lunisolar rhythm that has nothing to do with Gregorian calendars, but actually marks time by the position of the equinox, specifically where the node of the equinox is looking at, and the metonic cycles, how many metonic cycles have passed inside of that particular age. So there are lots of different ways of understanding or reckoning time, but for right now, the majority of the world tends to use the Gregorian calendar, even if only for business. And so it's a system that is pretty ubiquitous globally at this point to most of the people who are going to be utilizing this calendar. Thirdly, you need to know that this calendar only really applies to the northern hemisphere. As you go to the southern hemisphere, you're actually going to see significantly different stars, and it's going to be different seasons, and so on and so forth. So the data that I have in here does not apply to you. This is only applicable to northern hemisphere. To individuals that are interested in me teaching them how to be able to produce this data for the southern hemisphere so that they can produce this themselves for Australia and New Zealand and South America and so on and so forth, contact me. Let me know if you're interested. I'm more than willing to do that. I don't want to go through the trouble to calculate all of those things out, especially because I don't spend a whole lot of time in the Southern Hemisphere, at least at this present point in my life. So again, this calendar is only good for the Northern Hemisphere, only applicable to the Northern Hemisphere. All right, let's go ahead and take a look now at the basic construction. As you scroll down from this front cover page called the Astronomological Calendar 2023 page, as you scroll down one page in the digital copy or flip your calendar open in the physical copy, you're going to see what is called the monthly title placard page. This monthly title placard page basically just contains the name of the month and the year. So in this case, January 2023. And then directly underneath that, that contains the elections for the alchemical processes. As you take a look at that, you're going to see at a snapshot, at a glimpse, all of the alchemical processes that have dates during the month of January or during the month that the title placard belongs to for each of the relevant phases. Now you can see that some of them are actually in bold and some of them are in standard text. Those of them that are in bold, like January 17th after 1625 and January 20th all day long and January 2022, those are in bold. And so those mean that those are the most ideal dates for that process. They are the most ideal elections. Everything that is in standard print is going to mean that it's the next best election. So for instance, for sublimation, January 16th after 6:14 is a pretty good time. And again, this calendar is in 24-hour time. For those of you who don't know 24-hour time, just take whatever time it is, say like 22 o'clock, subtract by 12, and that will give you your 12-hour time. So in that case, 22 is actually going to be 10 o'clock p.m. So with that being said, though, sublimation is going to be pretty good on January 16th after 6:14. That is the next best election for that, or a next best election. All of the parameters for which are in the back of this book. So let's just scroll down there so that you can take a look at that. Here we go. We have the most ideal dates for alchemical lab processes in 2023. We talk a little bit about this and what the math is to be able to find it. And then we tell you, so for calcination, for instance, the most ideal date occurs when the sun and moon are both in the constellation of Aries. The next best dates are anytime the moon is in a waning phase in the constellation of Aries. So in 2023, there are no ideal dates for calcination, but the next best dates are, and then I list all of those out. So that's the way that we do this. We take all of this math. All of these were produced through intrinsic data field investigation, then repetitive split testing over here at the Research Academy to be able to validate those results in the lab. We continually have regular results with them, and we felt that this is worthy of publishing because it's significantly different than other astronomical or astrological cycles that are passed on in the traditions of the R+C and the Golden Dawn curriculum. As well as just through many other teachers and modern organizations that are still using sidereal astrology and saying that each of the 7 days actually belong to the 7 planets of the ancients and so on and so forth. There's numerous discrepancies between the data that we have found to be authentic and true and relevant objectively in the 21st century and the tradition, the way that we received it. So all of the information in this book is going to be the work as we have found it and as we have split tested it and as we have data for with the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy. So that's what these ideal elections are going to be. And they're going to be listed on the monthly title placard page for each month. Then you have a notes section. We used to have a meteor section and visible planets to the naked eye section, but that's highly subjective data. You can't necessarily see those from every state. You can't even see them, for instance, sometimes you'd be able to see them from the Pacific states, but you wouldn't be able to see them from eastern or even mountain states sometimes, just because of the time when it's dark or when you can actually see a meteor shower or other things. And so we had a lot of people who were confused by that in the 2022 astronomological calendar, being like, you're saying that these are visible, but they're not visible from where I'm at. And so we decided to just omit all of that information. And we also wanted a place for notes. And so this note area became really good. So underneath the elections for alchemical processes for each month, there's a notes section. You can, if you have Adobe Acrobat, actually type in that section by hitting a tab up here that says edit. You can edit text and images with this particular little tool here. And so if you have this tool, then you can type in your notes here, and that becomes really handy. In the physical copy, of course, you can do that with a pen, with a marker, with whatever, and mark up your calendar here. And you can talk about when you want to do things, when you did things, ideas that you have, when it's ideal. Maybe you can list out herbs for a particular day so that you know what it is that you want to work on, and all of your information is a little bit more contained. So that is what shows up on the monthly placard page every single month. Then directly underneath that, you're going to see the monthly data cells. The monthly data cells are basically in Gregorian calendar style, starting with Sunday as the first day of the week and going through Saturday, of course, and listed in number of the days sequentially. So, for instance, in January, there are 31 days, so you're going to see 31 numbered cells. And all of these cells basically show up with the exact same types of data. So let's go ahead and go through that, and I'll show you how to read that. In the upper left-hand corner, which is where we're going to start of each cell, so we're starting right up here, you're going to see the numerical date. Pretty simple. It just tells you whether it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. This is all Gregorian calendar style stuff. So this should be very ubiquitous and common sense to everybody. In this case, Sunday was actually the 1st of January. We began the week on a Sunday, so you're going to see that. If the month happens to begin on a Wednesday, for instance, you'll see that the 1st of the month is actually on a Wednesday cell. And that goes on throughout the whole calendar. As you go directly right to the upper right-hand corner of each cell, you are going to see what are referred to as the tropical and the synodic lunar data for that date. Tropical lunar rhythms deal with the ascending and descending moon cycles. So let me just find a date here. This date, January 6th, Friday, January 6th, you'll notice that before the actual moon phase symbol that you see this little phase. And again, that is going to be referred to as the tropical lunar rhythm, and that deals with ascending and descending moon. In this case, this is moving downwards, which means that this is a descending moon. This means that the moon is not moving up, but instead it is moving lower in the sky. So that is called the tropical lunar rhythm, where it moves up and it moves down. That is known as the ascending or descending or the tropical lunar cycle of the moon. Now, the way that this goes is that the moon starts going down here on the 6th, and it continues moving down until on the 20th, it begins its ascending cycle. And so it starts at its lowest point, and now it's ascending, and it will get to its highest ascending point, and then it will descend again, as you will find a token, which should be probably on February 2nd. It starts to descend again. Okay, so you're going to see at least 2 signs, a descending and an ascending every month. Every once in a while, you'll see 3 of those, a descending, ascending, and then descending again, or ascending, descending, and ascending again. They happen approximately every 2 weeks, but that is known as the tropical lunar rhythm. And so you'll encounter that before the actual moon phase. Now, if the phase is not a new moon or a full moon, then what you will see is actually just the moon phase at that very particular time, and whether it's waxing or waning. So we started off here in a waxing cycle going towards a full moon at the beginning of this year. So this is waxing, 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 full. And now it starts to wane. So technically, this is also a full moon here on Saturday because of the time frame. This happens in the evening, 1609. So all day Saturday basically is also going to be a full moon. But then you can see that right here, we have a tiny little bit of a sliver showing that we're waning. So waxing is going to show up on the left-hand side. Waning is going to start to show up on the right-hand side until that moon is completely dark, and that's going to be the new moon. So where there are times, that tells you the time that the moon goes full. And again, this is set to New York City in Eastern time, and when the moon goes new. And so I always have time data for that. That is important for the timing of magical rituals. It also tells you in the laboratory how far you can push your waxing phase, because the moment that it goes full, now it's no longer waxing, it's completely full. And most things are still good, or in this case, this would be full and this would be new. But this tells you some very important data about that time so that you can choose as the operator whether you want to start or stop a particular operation at a particular time based on the fullness of that moon. In most cases, around new moons, I'm going to probably stop doing calcinations and start doing leachings, for instance. There's a wide number of different types of things that you can utilize that data for, ascending and descending. Now, it is considered that this tropical rhythm, especially in biodynamics, in Maria-Thun biodynamics in particular, that ascending moon is when the Earth is exhaling. And so energy from the Earth is moving up from the Earth towards the cosmos. And then descending signs are when the Earth is breathing in. And so energy is coming from the cosmos into the Earth. So we kind of think of it as the respiratory cycle of the Earth and the cosmos. Are you exhaling or are you inhaling? And that is a beautiful way of taking a look at it. So for instance, if I wanted to distill something, I would probably want to do that on the exhalation cycle, which is going to be on a rising cycle, as opposed to doing it during a descending cycle. So there are different ways of utilizing that. And again, I talk about the agricultural influences, which is all that I have solid data for at the present moment inside of this book, in the back, inside of all of the written text in the back, especially in the Alchemical guidelines page. And I'll just scroll down to that really fast so that you can see where you can find that. Understanding how to use the calendar. Yeah, here we go. Notes about the moon. We have the ascending and descending moon. And so all of this is here. And then you will see this is the part, the ascending, descending moon. This would be ascending because it has an arrow up. So this is where you're going to find it and how to read and use the calendar. And in the alchemical concepts, we talk about the ascending and descending moon right here. So the ascending moon affects activities above the soil. Actions during this influence include foliar sprays, sowing seeds, harvesting fruit, seeds, flowers, and hay, and pruning cuttings for grafting. And then during the descending lunar cycle, you have anything that works below the soil. So actions during that influence include cultivating soil, which cultivating basically means culturing. And when we're talking about cultures, we're largely talking about microbes. So we are adding nutrients to the soil. We're doing other things that help the proliferation of the microbial activity inside of the soil. And if you're performing biodynamics, it's also cultivating and influencing the planetary or the cosmic cycles that are able to be stored inside of the soil and making it more receptive to that. Also applying horn manure, making and spraying compost or compost teas and compost preps, liquid manure, etc. Transplanting and pruning and harvesting root crops as well. So the ascending and descending lunar phases are important for those things. And of course, this does have corollaries to the laboratory. It's just that I haven't been able to absolutely prove these things with data and with repetitive split tests. I'm still working on that. So in future years, as I have a firm handle on these things, once I have a very firm handle and I've been able to get other people to practice under that and to observe the same things that I have observed, if all of that happens, then I will write about all of that and include that as information. But for right now, some of the aspects in the lab that I use are informed guesses. Some of them are informed speculation, and others of them seem to work for us, but have not been tested with others. So that's why I don't publish it. I'm very, very scholarly and academic in the way that I utilize the science and the testing methods that we use here, including our intrinsic data field analysis. But we need to be absolutely certain that not only we, but others are able to utilize data before we publish it and say, here's what this is good for. Otherwise, you end up sticking your foot in your mouth down the road. And Lord knows, there have been plenty of times where I've done that in my life. And so it's very important to me now, having learned those lessons, to be very certain that we only include information of what these things do if we have data, and I can stand behind it because of all the research in Maria-Thun, as well as tested by myself and multiple others, that there are definitive links between ascending and descending lunar cycles with agriculture. Okay, so that takes care of that. Now, all of the phases of the moon, those are called lunations. That's also known as synodic lunar data. So all of the tropical lunar data, which is going to be the ascending and descending times, and then the synodic data of the moon phases. along with times of the full moon and the new moon, are going to show up in the upper right-hand corner. So far, pretty easy. Now we have to discuss and break down all of the information that we have, which we consider to be astronomological. So the astronomological data is going to be this entire center point of the cell. Everything is aligned to the left for what we're calling astronomological data. Okay, so as we take a look at the first, and let me just see if I can zoom in on the first here so that we can take a look at this. And actually, maybe I should unhighlight some of that and see if I can. No, it's not going to allow me to do that. Okay, so all of you should be able to see the first here. We have our date, we have our synodic cycle, but then we see that at 00 hour, 24 minute, 54 seconds, Venus in Sagittarius is conjunct Pluto in Sagittarius. Now, if you're not familiar with how to read these signs, you're going to have to spend some time getting familiar with that and learning to translate each one of those astrological sigils into words. Now, that's actually pretty easy, and I do create a legend for this. If you're not used to that information, it may take a little bit of time, but it's not going to go too far. I swear, if you practice just with your planets first, memorize planets Sol through Pluto and their astrological sigils that we use in this text, which are pretty synonymous. There's a couple of different ways of writing Pluto, a couple of different ways of writing Uranus. But aside from that, you're going to see the exact same sigils here that you see in just about every other astrological text. Now, that being said, all of these planets, there's only 10 of them, will maybe take you a week to completely memorize. If you spend some time drawing them and then writing out right next to them what they mean, and then just try and look at a calendar cell and from memory every day, try and pick out the planets so that you know whether you're right or not, and you test yourself, kind of grade yourself, and then move on to all of your constellations. There's only 13 of them, so that'll take maybe another week, possibly 2 weeks. And then all of your aspects. Now, there are many more aspects in various forms of astrology than what we use here. In this form of astrology, we're only going to be using conjunctions, which mean that there's a 0 degree difference between the planets. Oppositions, which means that we are 180 degrees away. Squares, which are going to mean that we are 90 degrees away. Trines, which are going to mean that we are, I believe that's 30 degrees away. Sextile is going to be 60. And then retrograde means that from our perspective here on Earth, it appears as if a planet is moving backwards in the sky. And station direct, which means that it's actually moving in the quote-unquote normal direction that it would normally move. That's really all that you need to do in order to be able to read the astrological data in the astronomological section for each planet. Let me scroll down here. This gets a little fiddly when I zoom in so far. There we go. So yeah, that's basically the way that you're going to read this. Now, what is typically true is that conjunctions and trines are absolutely fantastic relationships between planets where they work together well. Sextiles, they can offer something, but it's usually not through like good synergy. It's usually through like, oh yeah, that was a hard experience, so I learned something beneficial from it. The end result is typically good, but not always. But you have something to learn from it regardless. And so sextiles would have that type of energy. Squares and oppositions are considered typically negative influences. And so, for instance, let's just take Trine here on the 2nd. We're going to take this one at 8:01:27. This is going to be the moon in Aries at a trine to Mercury in Sagittarius. Well, this is cool because this actually offers a lot of fire element. This is the moon in Aries. This is a cardinal fire sign, or what we would call a volatile fire sign inside of alchemical terminology, with Mercury in Sagittarius, which is a mutable fire sign. And so the chances for fire energy being very hot, very dry, and very intense that day is actually going to be pretty high, especially at this moment of 8:01:27. That's kind of going to be where it peaks. So you might actually see a trine happening a day before, because anything within about 3 degrees is considered an aspect. This calendar only shows what is called the perfect aspect, which means that it is directly at that geometric relationship of the trine. Does that make sense? And again, I have all of the trine and sextile data and everything like that somewhere on here. Let's go ahead and see where that's at. This is alchemical. Note about the aspects, trine, square, time zone. Maybe I don't have that information, but it seems maybe I included that in 2022 and we didn't have room for it in 2023. Let me just scroll down and see if we have any of that. If not, all of this information can be found very, very simply online. There is no difference between the geometric signs that we use in sidereal astrology or true sidereal astrology that are not used in other forms of astrology, and all of that stays true. So, but really, squares and oppositions, a square is 90 degrees, an opposition is 180 degrees, a conjunction is 0 degrees or 360 degrees, however you want to look at that. And trines, I believe, are 30 degrees, and sextiles, I believe, are 60 degrees out. So that's basically what we are taking a look at with astrological data. As you can see, all of the cells have a hour time, a minute time, and a second time for all of that. Now, the only thing that you're going to see that is different between the moon and every other sign, which I kind of alluded to earlier, is a void of course time. So here at 8:01:27, the moon was in Aries, but at 8:20, which is just, less than 19 minutes, 19 full minutes later, the moon is now going void of course. And so it is now no longer in Aries, nor is it in Taurus. But at 8:34:02, now it enters Taurus. So again, like I was talking about, all of the other planets just move from one constellation to the next, drawing the midpoint between those two as the cusp. The moon, we do not do that for, and that's because void of course times actually have agricultural applications in Maria Thun style biodynamic calendar. And we have found that and tested that to be extremely effective, and also to have some laboratory applications to it as well. So we typically try not to start a distillation or to try and start a tincturing during a void of course time, because that minimizes the amount of oomph that we're looking for. In fact, all of the times that you find that we're going to have these little sigils, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, these are elections for different plant parts, rely upon the moon being found in a very particular constellation. So go ahead and keep that in mind. So the moon goes void of course. That's what V over C means, void of course. And then when the moon goes back into another sign, you're going to see the moon, and then this ingress, this arrow indicates an ingress or a moving into, and then the constellation. So the moon moves into Taurus is the way to read that. Now, I have gone in manually and added in the sign of the elemental association to which this corresponds. So in this case, Taurus is a fixed earth sign. It corresponds to the earth. So I have this earth sign next to it so that you know what the prevalent element, Aristotelian element is, that corresponds to that particular zodiac. Other things that you're going to see are aphelion and perihelion data. So with that being said, we have like the mercurial perihelion. Perihelion means closest to the sun. Aphelion means farthest from the sun. You're going to see that for all of the planets, although really only the close ones have a lot of aphelion or perihelion data that you're going to see pretty regularly. And I also include that for the Earth. So you're going to see that. As the planets travel from one sign to the next, just like they do with the moon, you're also going to see a planet sign with an ingress into a new constellation. So this is Venus goes into Capricorn. That happens here on the 3rd. That's how to be able to read that. Lunar Aphelion, again, this means that the moon is closest to the sun. No, sorry, furthest away from the sun at this time. And so we continue to take a look at that type of data. Apogee and perigee. The apogee means that it is furthest away from the Earth. The perigee means that it's closest to the Earth. Blue moons and supermoons happen during perigees, and they also happen with other cycles too, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. And in fact, I think in 2023, if you're interested, those happen during July and August, the supermoons and blue moons. Well, actually, a blue moon is just any time that you get a full moon, 2 full moons in a month. But this one, we have a super blue moon this year, which is why I bring them up together. Ascending and descending lunar node data also is going to show up here in the astronomological section for each cell. And yeah, lunar perihelion, perigee, descending and ascending lunar nodes, all of the planetary perihelions and aphelions, all of those are all going to show up inside of the astronomological data. We're also going to have Mercury at the greatest western elongation, eastern elongation. I do that for Mercury. I also do that for Venus and a couple of others. What I do not do, though, is show when they are highest in the sky or directly over above or other things like that. If you're interested in that information, that's really easy to find out. You can go to in-the-sky.org, and you can go to their calendar of events and you can check that. Now, all of our ascending lunar time, descending lunar time, everything matches that same data because that is International Astronomical Union data, and there's very, very slight difference based on where you are and how you measure time, because time actually is altered with elevation and gravitational force and things that are constantly fluctuating, actually. So there are slight differences in time between where it may happen for you and where it's going to happen based on the times that we calculated from New York City, as I mentioned earlier in this text. So that is all of that information. So you will see that type of, that very same type of information astronomologically, month over month over month over month over month. Now, I do have what all of this data kind of means down here in the alchemical agricultural concepts and why we would use it. So the North Lunar Node and South Lunar Node are important because they create stress and we want to try and avoid them. So like stressful lunar influences are 6 hours before and 6 hours after a lunar node. So if there's an ascending lunar node, 6 hours before, 6 hours after, for a total of 12 hours, you should avoid working with the soil or doing things. And same thing with descending lunar nodes. They are basically like the effect of miniature eclipses, and they stress out microbes, they stress out lots of different types of things, and we can see this and observe this in soil microbiology as well as in horticulture and agricultural applications. Same thing with 12 hours before or after an apogee or a perigee. And that's why I include the lunar apogee and perigee data, aside from it just being interesting as well. But it actually is something that we need to take a look at. Now, again, we do find that there are corollaries to spagyric laboratory work for these. We have not identified what all of those variables are or could be or what the universal law is. And so we haven't included a complete page just showing the apogee and perigee data and how to utilize that in the laboratory. But this is hopefully why all of you are utilizing this calendar, is to help to research some of these ideas for yourself. And by all means, if you come up with something, please do not hesitate to write into us with what you have. If it's actually good enough, then what I will do is take your writing and actually pay you a sum of money so that we can include it in the publications for future years, and your article will be in each subsequent 2023 astronomological calendar based on what you found it useful for, so that other people can read about these things. I think that that would be very, very useful. We just don't have that many people operating at that level at the present time to actually be contributing besides ourselves. So the node passages of the moon, the apogee, perigee, ascending node, and descending node, which are node passages of the moon. 48 hours leading up to the new moon are stressful lunar influences. 48 hours leading up to the full moon are beneficial influences, and also any time that the moon is in an opposition to Saturn. So you will find that the moon is in opposition to Saturn, typically once or twice a month. Let's just see if we can find time. Right here we're at a sextile to Saturn, so we're starting to get close. We'll just keep kind of moving on here until I find an opposition. Let's see, we have moon there, we have square. Where is Saturn? Let's just try and find one of these times. There's moon and Saturn still at a sextile. Oh, that's in December. Let me zoom out and see if I can find something here. Let's take maybe what I can do is run a filter and try to do the moon. Whoops. I wonder why that didn't copy there. Moon. We want to also find that one. Actually, that is a conjunction. I need an opposition sign. Hey, here we go. This just so happened to work. The moon in Leo at an opposition to Saturn in Aquarius. So this is a moon opposite Saturn, and that is a very beneficial sign for the soil based on Maria Thun biodynamic split test that she ran for many, many, many years. And so you can see that it's a good time for sowing and transplanting foliar sprays with silica during moon opposite Saturn times. The moon in different constellations, of course, based on its correspondence here, is either going to be good for roots, tubers, corms, and rhizomes if it corresponds to an earth element. So if the moon is in Taurus, Virgo, or Capricorn, then it is an earth sign, and then those are going to be times that typically mean that the moon is governing over or sending energy to roots, tubers, corms, and rhizomes of any particular plant. If the moon is in Cancer, Scorpio, or Pisces, then it's going to accentuate the leaves, stems, foliage, and thorns of the plant. We're also going to have air signs, which are going to be Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius, that accentuate the flowers, stamens, petals, and pollen of plants. Fire signs, which are going to be Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius, that correspond to the fruits, nuts, and seeds of a plant. And then, of course, this is going to be microbes, and this only happens when the moon is actually in Aquarius, or the 13th sign, and that deals with compost tea, microbes, different types of things like that. It's typically good for culturing. So these are the plant correspondences. Now, again, the Maria Thun biodynamic calendar, no other biodynamic calendars that I'm aware of actually take Ophiuchus into account. It's a very small constellation anyway, and so they typically just lump sum it into Scorpio. But the International Astronomical Union does acknowledge that a portion of Ophiuchus actually is along the ecliptic, and so we count that entire portion inside of true sidereal astrology, as well as in international astronomical astronomy data these days. And so we had to see, are there any sorts of associations with this? And yes, there are. Over and over and over, we were able to find that it works with compost tea and microbes. And in medical astrology, proper what we're calling Aurelian spagyric medical astrology in particular, we're finding that Ophiuchus works with DNA, genes, various different proteins that are necessary for synthesizing RNA and DNA, and so on and so forth. So there is a definitive link to the constellation of Ophiuchus that is definitively separate from Scorpio, and this is why we include it inside of our calendar. So all of that data is astronomological data. All right, let's see if I missed anything. Yeah, so the draconic lunar rhythms we talked about, those are ascending and descending lunar nodes. Those are called draconic lunar rhythms. And that's because we consider the north lunar node the dragon's head, It's also sometimes known as Ketu in Ayurvedic, or just we'll call that Vedic astrology. And then we have the descending lunar node, which is known as the dragon's tail. And that is also known as, I think it's Rahu is ascending and Ketu is descending in Vedic. I'd have to look back over that. But at any rate, Rahu, Ketu, or Ketu and Rahu. And then we also have the dragon's head is what it's referred to in the West, typically in dragon's tail. So that's why it's called the Draconic lunar rhythm. We also have the Animalistic, or Anomalistic would be the better pronunciation of that, lunar rhythms, which are going to be the Apogee and Perigee cycles. We also have the Heliacal Apsidal Precession, which are the Perihelion and Aphelion cycles. So all of those are on there. Other things that you're going to see on here from time to time are going to be the solstices, equinoxes, and the solar cross quarters. And there are a couple of alchemical things too that I put in here. So in February, for instance, around February 3rd this year, in fact, directly on February 3rd, is Imbolc. Imbolc marks, and this is the cross quarter, okay? I know that there are a lot of different ways of calculating Imbolc. A lot of them just would celebrate Imbolc on the 1st of February, or sometimes from the sunset of the 1st until the 2nd of February. Some people do it from the 31st of January until the 1st of February. Other people tend to do the moon, the full moon that is closest to the cross quarter date. In this year, that would have been the 5th. So really all I'm trying to do is show the cross quarter, which means that the sun is perfectly halfway between the winter solstice and the spring equinox. That is when the cross quarter of Imbolc happens each year. So I show that cross quarter and what date and what time it falls on. And then in March, for instance, then you will see the spring equinox. And the spring equinox this year happens on the 20th at 1724, 17 hour, 24 minute, 00 seconds, Eastern time. Okay, so all of your equinoxes, solstices, and solar cross quarters are all going to be contained inside of this calendar. And again, the cross quarters are the solar cross quarters because that allows you to find out when it is that you want to celebrate if you use other astronomological timings. Like, for instance, one of the Druid orders to which I belong actually uses the heliacal setting of the star known as Fomalhaut in order to celebrate their form of Imbolc. And that's going to happen this year. I think that happened around January 21st. Another one of the Druid orders to which I belong celebrates Imbolc on the full moon following the Imbolc cross quarter, which in this case again was February 5th. So all of this type of data is there so that you can decide based on your traditions when you want to be able to celebrate or want to perform, special initiatory lab work or other things like that. All of that information is in here because of that. It's specifically applicable to alchemists, to magicians, to even agriculture, I'm sure in many cases. The biodynamic calendars typically tend to work with Christian holiday dates like Michaelmas and other things like that. I have not found that most of those are actually that applicable because they are Gregorian dates and they have nothing to do with actual astronomical cycles. If anything, they are drawing their energy from the importance that people, namely Christians, hold to those particular days, and they are not astronomical in any way. So that's why I've omitted different dates that are important in biodynamic calendar work, typically like Michaelmas and Candlemas and stuff like that. But Candlemas is very, very close to Imbolc. So again, you have all the data that you need in order to be able to find this information out. So, yeah, let's see if there's anything else there that I left out. Okay, yes, let's talk about lunar occultations. A couple of people have asked me, why do I not include lunar occultation? First of all, let's define that for people that don't know what that means. A lunar occultation is basically when the moon passes between another planet and the Earth. And so imagine how the moon passes between us and the sun during an eclipse. The moon is passing between us and a planet. So it's kind of like a planetary eclipse, if you want to think of it like that, of the moon. That is known as a lunar occultation. And that basically means that the moon is hiding a particular planet. Occult, again, just meaning hidden. So, with that being said, lunar occultations are going to happen right at or right near any particular conjunction with that planet, because all other planets are further away from us than the moon. And so, as Mercury and the moon become conjunct from Earth, we cannot see Mercury because the moon is conjunct Mercury. We see the moon instead. That is known as a lunar occultation. So anytime that you find a conjunction of the moon and another planet, that you know that within about a 10 to 15-minute window, the lunar occultation is going to happen. So that is already implied by the conjunction of the moon with any given planet, and it's not really necessary for us to spell out a lunar occultation, which would take up more space. And then sometimes we just don't have the availability to fit all of that. Like, for instance, here on the 17th of this month that we're taking a look at, there's no more space for data. We can't include anything more. And there were many different types of days where we didn't have room for that type of data. And because it's already implied, it's not necessary to spell out once you know that that's going to happen with a conjunction. All right, let's talk about our elections for alchemical processes just really fast. Again, I already showed where those are. Those are on the monthly title placard. So here we are for March. Here's all the elections for the alchemical processes. I already showed the page down here. It's actually 2 pages. The most ideal dates for alchemical lab processes in 2023. I talk about that. I also give the parameters. So if you don't like my parameters and you want to calculate according to your own, or use tropical astrology, my parameters, but within tropical astrology, or so on and so forth, in order to be able to try and find the best dates so that you can split test, you have all that information inside of here. So that is really quite important. The other thing that is probably the most important, that I think most people actually bought the calendar for, is the elections for the plant parts. Now, I kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but I'm a lot more strict about this than the Maria Thun biodynamic calendar, and even the Stella Natura biodynamic calendar, and other biodynamic calendars that I've seen. The reason is that it's hard for me to show, like, for instance, here, let's take a look at this. This is October that we're taking a look at. October 12th at 3:25 in the morning, the moon goes void of course. Before that, the moon was in Leo. Now, as of 5:18:51, the moon goes into Virgo. Very few people are actually going to be awake during the time that the moon is in Leo. So technically, the moon in Leo during a waning phase is not ideal for working with fruits, because it's in a waning phase. If we were in a waxing phase of the moon, then it would be absolutely ideal to work with fruits. But the waning phases tend to deal with all subterranean parts. Waxing phases deal with aerial parts of things. There's also a correlation, of course, between the ascending and the descending lunar cycles with some of that information as well. So with that being said, this is not an ideal time for fruits, because it is during a waning phase. So I don't say that, oh, and also because of the time, very few people are going to be up before 3:25 in the morning on the 12th working on things in the laboratory. I'm not saying that you can't or that you shouldn't, just saying that very few people are going to do that or are going to undertake a new project at that time. It's nowhere near sunrise. It's just not ideal within the alchemical corpus of how we do things. So what we have done is just show the very best times to do something. So after 518, or technically 518.51, so I just approximate this to 519, it is now a good root time because Virgo is an earth sign and earth deals with roots, and it's also a waning moon. So you will notice that all of my root signs only show up when the moon is in an earth sign during a waning moon. And it's even better if it's during a waning moon during a descending lunar phase like it is right here. See, the ascending lunar phase doesn't happen until the 20th. So this date of the 12th that we're looking at is still a descending lunar phase. And so this is absolutely ideal for subterranean parts. So I have all of these types of elections inside of here. Now, I will still include an election, even if it's not a descending lunar cycle, just as long as two things are in place. One is going to be the lunar phase is waning for the root part, and that the moon is in an Earth-based constellation. And if those two things are true, then I will include the election for that thing. Now, I was a lot less discriminatory this year than I was last year. Last year, I was going through all of the astronomological data in here and trying to see if there would be any sextiles, any squares, any oppositions that would say that the Earth influence was lessened. For instance, if fire, the moon in a fire sign, well, that wouldn't work. Let's say Mars in a fire sign was conjunct the, nope, that also wouldn't work. Mars in a fire sign was at a trine to, there we go, the moon in Virgo. Now that's going to add a lot of fire to this air, to this earth element rather, and that is going to produce wind. Anytime that we add fire to earth, it produces wind, just like in pyrolytic distillations. Same thing if we do the same thing. If we add fire to water, that produces wind or air. And so it decreases the quality of the earth sign and the stability of the earth sign a little bit. And so last year I was a lot more discriminatory than I was this year. This year I've decided based on data that we should actually include all of the elections just as long as they fit that data. The astronomological position of the moon is in a constellation that corresponds to a sign that also and the moon is also in a phase that corresponds to that part of the plant. So for instance, Earth and waning phases both correspond to roots, and so root elections are going to show up during that time. Flower means that the moon is going to be in an air sign, and it also means that the moon is going to be in a waxing sign. So these two lunar cycles here are really important. We call this the synodic cycle. And then we also talk about it being in a particular zodiac. Sometimes I've heard of this as its ecliptic cycle. I think there's even a more precise word for it. Yeah, basically just lunar ingresses and the constellations, the association, the elemental association of the constellations of. So all of these elections were made with that in mind. And anytime that the moon is in Ophiuchus, that is going to be an absolutely ideal time for microbial work, for fermentation work, for gathering samples to be cultured, and so on and so forth. And that's equally as applicable in the lab as it is in microbiology, setting up compost teas and agricultural work, and taking samples from the soil, beginning to culture them, inoculating spores for mushroom growth, all sorts of things like that are best done during an Ophiuchus phase. And even more so when Ophiuchus lines up 72 to 48 hours before a full moon. Now that's really, really ideal. And I mark those out as the best fermentation days as well, which I think happened in June of this year of 2023, if I remember right. So that's that. The fruit sign is going to indicate that fruits, seeds, nuts are all accentuated during that time. That means that you can plant them, transplant them, harvest them, and also extract them all during fruit times. So if I wanted to work on, say, bell fruit, or if I wanted to work on camu camu berry or lemon peel or anything that's really a fruit or a seed, right? Fennel seed, caraway seed, etc. We would want to look at those and look at the dates and find a date that is a fruit date to begin that extraction. Again, that will mean that the moon is in a constellation that corresponds to fire, and it will also mean that the moon is in a waxing synodic cycle. So those are the two things that create the criteria for the election of a fruit day. Flower days are going to be when the moon is in a constellation corresponding to an air sign and the synodic cycle is waxing. We will also see leaf days, here we are, which means that the moon is in a constellation that corresponds to water and its synodic cycle is also waxing. Those are the three that you're going to get as waxing phase cycles or waxing phase elections. Waning phase elections are exclusively going to be roots, corms, tubers, and rhizomes, which means that the way that we get there is that the moon is going to be in a constellation that corresponds to the Earth during a waning synodic cycle. Then any time that the moon passes through Ophiuchus, whether waning or waxing, is an ideal fermentation time or a time to take a culture. I find that attenuation speeds are best 3 days before the full moon, regardless of where the moon is at. So if you're looking to attenuate something, that's going to be the best time. Same thing with like spores. If you're trying to colonize something, if you put it in 3 days before the full moon, you will find that it tends to colonize the substrate a whole lot faster than just about any other time of the month. That being said, you can take spore prints, for instance, if it's during a waxing phase or a waning phase on this type of Ophiuchus day. So these are different types of ways of looking at this. Again, roots, tubers, corms, and rhizomes like trillium root, false unicorn root, burdock root, dandelion root. All of those types of things can be planted, harvested, transplanted, or extracted on days where you're going to see this little caret sigil, which stands for the roots. Seeds, nuts, fruits, all of these things, betel nut, caraway seed, cumin, black seed, lemon peel, okay, camu camu, all of these types of things, all of the fruits are going to work well on a fruit day. Flowers are going to be flowers, blossoms, pollen even, okay? So if you're going to be working with pine pollen, we find that that works best on a flower day. Stamens, like blue lotus stamens, like saffron stamens, things like that, they work best on a flower day. Same thing with fresh flowers and dried flowers. If the flower holds on to a tremendous amount of moisture, it's best to tincture that while it's dried, or ideally freeze-dried even. Whereas some flowers that don't contain a lot of moisture, or petals even that don't contain a lot of moisture, are fine tinctured as is because they don't have a lot of plant phlegm that's going to muck up the iatrochemical reactions that we're looking for within the spagyric tincturing process. And of course, if you're doing other things with them, like essential oil distillation, which is perfect to do on a flower day of, say, roses or lavender or any sort of flower, then you don't have to worry about drying it or not drying it. So it really just depends on the work at hand. And that's why we are showing the plants and the processes as two separate different types of elections, or the parts of plants. Leaves are going to be anytime that the moon is in a constellation that corresponds to water and during a waxing synodic cycle. So this is going to be, say, like dandelion leaf, kratom, all sorts of different types of things like that. We get questions all the time about cannabis. If you're extracting just cannabis leaf and stalk, then maybe a leaf time would work. Otherwise, cannabis is actually a bud. It's a flower. And so you'd want to work on that under a flower time. Okay, so again, I've spent a lot of time beating the drum on these particular elections, but this is what most people are actually using this calendar for based on the feedback and the data I have. And I want to let you know that this is how you can find that data. So if you switch to, say, a tropical style for your own split tests, again, all you would do is try and find when the moon is in a constellation, or in the case of tropical, when the moon is in a zodiac sign that corresponds to a particular element. Like, for instance, if you're looking for roots, you would want to have the moon in a zodiac sign that corresponds to the Earth, and then you would also want to make sure that the moon is in a waning cycle. So you would be able to take those two pieces of criteria and transfer that to any form of astrology that you want for split tests, including Vedic astrology, which is a type of sidereal astrology, tropical astrology. You could even use this in other forms of astrology if you really wanted to get wild, like Mayan astrology and so on and so forth. You would just have to understand what kind of tzolk'in you were looking at, and then the moon phase, and you would be able to transfer that data approximately to find your ideal elections in other systems of astrology. So that is a basic rundown of the calendar. There's a lot of implied ways of being able to utilize this calendar. Some of the things we already have a great idea about, like we found that it's ideal to purify and perform rectifications and distillations of raw wine and things like that during ascending lunar phases, because the Earth is breathing out. What is in the flask is breathing out and up. We also find that during those times, it's best to use a taller system, or to use some sort of fan or a condenser to be able to condense it a little bit better, because it's very volatile and trying to move up. But as a result of that, if we perform philosophic distillations and we drive our heat down and don't try and boil at the actual boiling temperature, but keep it below the boiling temperature, we can oftentimes do that. Now, there are a couple of variables to things like that, like, for instance, barometric pressure. Barometric pressure has a lot to do with how fast something is going to come to a boil and how much heat is necessary in order to bring it to a boil. So you do have to keep an eye on various local conditions like that. And barometric pressure inside and outside can be two different things as well. So there's things like that. Also, internal temperature and humidity. The greater the humidity, the greater speed with which heat is able to fill a room, and so it can get hotter or colder inside of a place, apparently based on the humidity. And so all of these different types of environmental factors that you can control in your lab with a dehumidifier or a humidifier, or by opening a window or closing a window, or not running AC or running AC, or having fans on or not having fans on. All of these things are going to increase the pressure or decrease the pressure in a room, as well as increase the humidity or decrease the humidity of a room. And so to some degree, in modern laboratories, you are able to control that with some pretty available and readily inexpensive pieces of equipment. So rectifications and distillations of raw wine material tend to work better, in philosophic distillations just in general during ascending lunar phases. Descending lunar phases are great for dissolutions. They're great for conjunctions and coagulations of material. They are great for a wide number of things. We even find that they're really good for filtrations. Anything where things are moving down and in and towards a center, those types of laboratory processes tend to work best during those descending cycles. Anything that's moving upwards or volatilizing, like volatilizing salts, for instance, tend to work good with ascending tropical cycles. So there is some cool information that way. And of course, I'm still split testing that, but I do feel confident enough in my observations to be able to at least mention that in this video. And in future years, you'll probably see that in the written text portion of the calendar as well. So yeah, all of this information is in here. Everything that we talked about is actually in here. All you have to do is just go through and read it. I know that a lot of this might be over your head, but it's pretty simple stuff if you just put it together. The basest thing is to memorize your astrological symbols. Do the planets first, then the constellations, then move to all of your aspects, and that will be able to give you the basis of what you need to read your astrological stuff. And again, just remember the general rule that trines and conjunctions are good or beneficial influences, that squares and oppositions are not so great influences. They offer strife or they work against each other, and that sextiles can be beneficial in the long run. They always are to some degree, but usually because it teaches you something. And so it can be a trying or a difficult experience, but you get something out of it that you didn't necessarily bargain for. You didn't get what you wanted, but you got something else. And those are valuable moments, especially valuable takeaways. But if you are performing work on, say, an herb that corresponds to Jupiter, for instance, and there is a square between Jupiter and, say, Venus, or a square between Jupiter and Mercury, you may or may not really want to undertake the work because you risk having that material being not going the way that you wanted it. You might learn something new, but you're not going to want it. When we got blue salts, for instance, Saturn was at a square to one of the other planets. I forget which at the present moment. I'd have to look in my notes. But we noticed that there were some problems there. Also, the barometry was really, really high. We had a very high barometric pressure. And there was one other condition too that, oh yeah, the solar geomagnetic activity that day was really high. There were a lot of different types of solar flares. So when we take a look at the B sub Z value is what that is called. And that's not an astronomical thing, that's a meteorological thing. So I can't include that in the calendar. There's no way for me to predict a whole year in advance what the meteorology is going to be. You're going to have to check those types of conditions all the time. And that deals with solar geomagnetic activity, barometry, and humidity, as well as ambiental temperature. Those types of things are all going to be variables and or controls inside of your laboratory work. And to a lesser degree, also to the soil and to agricultural endeavors as well. So at any rate, that is a basic rundown. We will create an Alchemical podcast episode sometime soon for this new season about what even led me to having to create this and all of the multiple clinical trials that we've run, both on human clients as well as on animal clients and on plants, in the garden and in the lab, that ultimately led me to this form of astrology and the practice of astronomology, the way that we practice it here at the Phoenix Aurelius Research Academy, and kind of going from there. So at any rate, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at support@phoenixaurelius.org. We'll always do our best to answer your questions in a very timely manner. And again, thank you guys so much for your purchase and support of this calendar. It has drastically helped us to be able to time things and create consistency and regularity in spagyric workings for the 21st century. And above and beyond that, it's, we're constantly figuring things out as a result of having this calendar that we otherwise would struggle to calculate. So it's a huge undertaking for me to produce each year, but I think that it's worth it. And if you think that it's worth it too, please share the news about it with your friends. And let's really make it popular, because this is a great way to be able to introduce and familiarize planetary and cosmic cycles to a culture that could definitely utilize them and drastically needs to use it for enhanced vitality and sustainability of our agriculture and for enhanced efficacy of our laboratory work. At any rate, thank you again. And like I said, if you have any questions, just go ahead and reach out to us and we'll take it from there. Thanks so much. Have a great one.